Okay, welcome. Thank you all for being patient. We're mixing it up a little bit this year so we can be in this beautiful chapel that has been recently renovated. If you've been here in years past, you know that this was used to store lawnmowers. I'm not exaggerating, so this is a vast improvement. We are focusing our stories this evening around the story of Isabel, Bacon, Rogers, Smith, Johnson. That's right, she had a few husbands. She led a very fascinating life and did most of it right here in Neenah. So the 4 stories that you are going to hear all revolve around Isabel. Her home that she constructed with her final husband, Orrin, who you'll also hear from this evening, was just listed on both the state and national register of historic places. Shout out to Emmanuel. His wife Flo can't be here, but if you know the Historical Society, you probably know Flo and Emmanuel. They live in this house and they're taking great care of it. So thank you for being here. With that, I will mention that we have a very large crowd outside that's about ready to break down the door. So once you have heard from all 4 of the actors, if you could please get up and make room for everyone else, that would be wonderful. We will be taking a slight pause in between each of the presentations for people to enter and exit as needed. But without further ado, let's hear from Isabel.
How did Belle Bacon, a girl born in Saugatuck, Michigan, end up buried here in Oak Hill Cemetery? Well, how much time you got? I was born to John and Elizabeth Bacon in 1870. We lived a comfortable life, and my parents eventually moved us to Mount Pleasant, Wisconsin, near Racine. We were close with our cousins, the Horlicks, who became wealthy from their malted milk business. As a teenager, I became locally known for what was lauded as my beautiful singing voice. During a picnic and boating party in 1885, when I was 15, I became acquainted with Henry Rogers. Henry was 25, but I had noticed him at St. Luke's Church, where we were both members of the choir. 3 years later, I graduated high school, where our class motto was, "Let our mistakes be stepping stones to perfection." Well, isn't that the truth? Speaking of mistakes, when I was 19, I married Henry Rogers, the one from the church choir. We had a beautiful ceremony where I wore a lovely satin gown and everything was adorned with roses. In September of 1890, I gave birth to what would be my only biological child, a son, Ronald Rogers. We brought him home to our Queen Anne-style home in Racine. A few years later, Henry received a promotion at the Union National Bank of Racine, and we announced plans to construct a new home. Our house on Wisconsin Avenue was a Queen Anne style, and featured a polygonal tower and dormer with leaded glass windows. By 1896, there were some cracks in my marriage to Henry. I had an unfortunate incident involving a railway and was awarded a handsome sum of money. Let's just say it gave me the financial independence to leave Henry. I took my 6-year-old Ronald with me, and we headed to Neenah and opened up a dancing school. Divorces at this time were rare. While I prefer not to disclose the reasons for my marriage failing, it nevertheless did. I had my reasons for hiding my divorce and referring to myself as a widow. My reputation was at stake. I would reinvent myself from Belle to Isabel, the beautiful widow with a young son. In 1899, I met a fabulously wealthy widower named C.R. Smith, who made his money at Menasha Woodenware and lost his wife in childbirth. He was a father to 3 young children. I joined him for the wedding of mutual friends and at the opera. These outings happened to make the society pages. By June of 1900, news of our engagement had broke. Let's just say it caused a bit of a scandal. The newspaper said all sorts of things. My favorite was that Charles named the town of Ladysmith after me, as if that was something that would make my heart flutter. The Racine Journal-Times picked up the story and outed me as a divorcee and not a widow. As if that were not enough, the Appleton Post-Crescent printed that I had been a housekeeper for Mr. Smith. The audacity. I would never clean Charles's house. Despite the press, we were married on the morning of June 6, 1900, at my mother's home on Franklin Avenue. The house was decorated in roses, and I wore a gown of silk embroidery, and Charles looked dapper in a green traveling suit. We left on the noon train that day and headed to New York, followed by 2 months in Europe. We let the gossip back home simmer back while we enjoyed lavish travel. In 1903, I starred in a charity production at the Grand Opera House in Oshkosh. I entertained the cast at our palatial home on Forest Avenue. I had several dresses made for me in France to wear in the plays and at the events. Charles built the house on Forest Avenue with his first wife, Jenny, and after we were married, I made it my own. I decorated it in a French style and had a Steinway piano designed for the music room. One thing I did very well during my marriage to Charles is entertaining. We threw elaborate parties in our carriage house. As the children became introduced to society, it was crucial that we made sure they were socializing with the right people. I loved driving automobiles. As early as 1905, I was driving as far as Oshkosh. I also loved spending time in New York City. We had a lovely, well-appointed apartment on West 72nd Street. It had room for our staff, a telephone system, and service elevators. It was also where my dear Charles would spend his last days. Charles died in 1916 at only 61 years old. At 46, I was now a true widow. He was Wisconsin's wealthiest resident. His fortune was set to be divided between his children and myself. I ended up with a payout of over $700,000 in addition to real estate, property, and other assets. It amounted to about $22 million in modern currency. 2 years later, I wed a Broadway actor, Orrin Johnson, at my Park Avenue apartment in New York City. I waited to marry until 8 months after Charles' estate was settled. It was the least I could do. Celebrity photographers from a Fifth Avenue studio captured an image of me in my wedding dress. It was featured in the society pages. Charles' daughter, Sylvia, ended up with the Forest Avenue mansion. And that was fine by me. I was ready to build a home with Orrin and set out to do just that. We tore down a small cottage I had built for my mother some years back. We would create a modern arts and crafts house that would accommodate my new life. The home on the corner of 9th and Forest is an elegant piece of architecture. I hear a lovely French couple live there now. How fitting. I sure hope they appreciate the features Orrin and I designed. On the first floor of the home, all the rooms were interconnected with bifold French doors. My private sitting room had direct access to the kitchen and an attached garage. For practical purposes, of course, I wanted to be near my staff and my car. I built the first 3-car attached garage in the city of Neenah. It is all still there. Orrin and I would share 25 years in the home before he passed away. It was a devastating loss, and so soon after my son Ronald had died. My final years were spent with my daughter-in-law Doris and my grandchildren Ronald Jr. and Doris Jr. We traveled and vacationed. The grandchildren were well educated on the East Coast, so I would spend the school year in New York City and return to Neenah for the summers. I died at home from a cerebral hemorrhage, having outlived 3 husbands and my only child. I was buried here in Oak Hill. I am next to Orrin, but also near my beloved son and my husband, Charles, who is in the Smith Mausoleum with his first wife, Jenny. Doris and her children would manage my estate. The contents of my beautiful home were auctioned off and the house sold. It was the last of my line in Neenah. The only thing that survives is the house and the memories. Thank you.
Okay, our next performance will be Orrin Johnson, who is the third and arguably best husband of Isabel. Orrin was a Broadway star who ended up in Neenah because of Isabel, and his story will be told by the Neenah Historical Society's Board of Director president, Jim Taylor.
I have one regret regarding my career. I should have done more Shakespeare. I played Master Ford in The Merry Wives of Windsor, and I did star as Romeo in a Shakespearean mask. Oh, how I would have enjoyed playing Hamlet. To die, to sleep perchance to dream. Ah, there's the rub. When we have shuffled off this mortal coil, must give us pause. There's the respect that makes calamity of so long life. I was born in Louisville, Kentucky in December 1865, a few months after the Union victory in the Civil War. I never performed in high school plays, but as salutatorian of the Louisville Male High School, I delivered an oration on the decay of the drama. In it, I lamented that stage productions had devolved to nothing more than something to please the public, rather than properly picturing the age in which the drama had been written. My first job was as a railroad cashier. I only stayed a couple of years. In 1887, I contracted malaria. Luckily, I enjoyed a full recovery, and soon after launched my acting career. After gaining experience in local theater, I set off for New York in 1890. There, actress Effie Ellsler accepted me as a member of her company. I appeared as Jack Rogers in The Governess. It was only a small part, but caught the attention of the great theatrical producer, Charles Frohman. After a few years, I worked exclusively for Mr. Frohman. Poor Charles died with over 1,000 other passengers when a German submarine torpedoed the steamship Lusitania in 1915. In 1903, after appearing in more than 20 Broadway shows, I finally got a starring role. I played the Marquis de Roulier with the talented Annie Russell in Hearts Courageous. I saved a few clippings from the reviews. Hope you don't think I'm reading these to inflate my ego. The New York Sun reviewer wrote, "There seems to be no valid reason why Orrin Johnson," that's me, "should not be a star. He has the greatest talent of all, youth, and to this inestimable quality is added good looks, a virile presence, considerable personal magnetism, and a profound belief in himself." The theater critic from the Mount Vernon Argus stated, "Has any actor ever received such cordial welcome on his first stellar appearance as that which has been given to Mr. Johnson by both the public and the press?" After Hearts Courageous, I starred in 14 Broadway productions with leading actors. Maude Adams, who played the first ever Peter Pan, was a great favorite of mine. I also shared the stage with Jane Darwell, an old friend from Louisville. She made the transition to movies and acted in more than 100 films. You may remember her as Ma Jode in The Grapes of Wrath. I had a brief movie career myself. Early films were made in New York City. I played one of the Musketeers in the 1916 version of The Three Musketeers. In fact, my good friend Douglas Fairbanks, perhaps the leading male actor of the era, copied most of my business when he produced and starred in the 1921 Hollywood adaptation. All the movies in which I appeared were silent. Ironically, it was my voice that made my career. While I preferred acting on stage to the cinema, I would have been a smash in the talkies. My life took an incredible turn in June 1918 when I married the beautiful widow Isabel Smith. The New York Times headline read, "Rich Widow Weds Orrin Johnson Actor." The article also noted that Isabel's late husband, a Wisconsin timberman, left an estate estimated at over $20 million. We were married at 4:30 p.m. in Isabel's Park Avenue home. We spent every summer in Neenah, but often returned to New York for my acting jobs. My last appearance was in 1925 as George Lorimer in The Ostriches. It was only a supporting role in a play that the reviewers panned. It closed after 8 performances, a disappointing conclusion to an illustrious career. Acting did not make me a wealthy man. Isabel gave me a weekly allowance of $5. We called it walking around money. I sent half of it to my brother Leon, who needed it much more than I did. When I married Isabel, I became stepfather to her son Ronald. Dr. Ronald Rogers and his wife Doris had 2 children. I was particularly close to Ronald Jr., or Bo as we called him. He loved hearing stories about my life in the theater and listened to my operatic records. It gave me the greatest joy spending time with him. Ronald Jr. ended up in Hollywood with a movie contract. He had a great voice and appeared in more than 40 stage plays and movie musicals. He got an appointment to see the great movie producer Cecil B. DeMille, a former colleague of mine in New York. DeMille told Ronald, "I would have known you anywhere. You so resemble your grandfather, Orrin." Ron never told him that I was not a blood relative. However, I did have influence on Bo's demeanor, which made me proud. My stepson, Dr. Ronald Rogers, died in 1942. He was only 51. It nearly killed Isabel and cast a dark shadow over our marriage. I found happiness taking long walks through Neenah, especially in our Dory Island neighborhood. I always carried candy for the children I met along the way. I shuffled off this mortal coil in November 1943, a little more than a year after Dr. Rogers. My final resting place is here in Oak Hill Cemetery. From growing up in Reconstruction Louisville, to being a local actor, to starring in Broadway and in silent films, to marrying Isabel, and becoming a loving stepfather and grandfather, my life would make a great Hallmark movie. In the end, I found a true home in Neenah. Oh, one more thing. If you tour the family grave sites, I have a favor to ask. My tombstone has a minor error. It has my birth date as 1866. It should be 1865. Maybe you could check with somebody to see if you could fix it. Thank you.
Okay, next we will be hearing from Dr. Ronald Rogers, who is the only biological child that Isabel had. Dr. Rogers is being portrayed by Vance Hughes, who is a member of our board of directors of the Historical Society. Vance also owns and operates a monument restoration business, and he has single-handedly restored many of the stones that you see in Oak Hill, including all of the headstones of the people featured this evening. So with that, we will welcome Dr. Ronald Rogers.
You've heard from my mother, Isabel, yes? Quite a woman she was. Isabel and my father, Henry, divorced when I was about 6. Did she tell you he died and that she was a widow? Yeah, that sounds like Isabel. The truth is that I was born to Racine banker Henry Rogers and Isabel in 1891. Despite my parents' divorce, I would often visit my family and father in Racine. My mother married widower C.R. Smith of Menasha Wooden Ware in 1900. And we moved into the big Smith mansion on East Forest Avenue. I came into a ready-made family with my step-siblings Maury, Carlton, and Sylvia. Their mother had died giving birth to Sylvia. I was especially close to my stepbrothers Maury and Carlton. C.R. treated me as his own, including me on summer trips with his sons. The 3 boys went off to Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire for high school. It was common for children of wealthy families to be educated on the East Coast at prestigious preparatory schools. I would join my siblings back in Neenah every winter and summer break. My mother enjoyed hosting elaborate parties for us and our friends. Our family was known for our barn parties. Isabel's love of music also influenced me, and I became an accomplished trumpet player. After high school at Exeter, I enrolled in medical school at Columbia University in New York City. The intense 7-year program would consume my attention during the school year. I would come home to Neenah every summer and would join my friends and siblings in tennis tournaments, taking place oftentimes on Smith courts. We went to the state tournament in Waupaca in 1914, but we were sorely beaten. Isabel threw us one heck of a party to ring in New Year's in 1914. The barn party included a full military orchestra. No expense was spared. The following semester, back at college, I was elected to lead the Columbia University Band. It was a real honor to lead the 35-piece band of accomplished musicians. When I was home, I would play my trumpet with bands, even performing at the Neenah Theater and also the newly constructed Shattuck Park. When my stepfather, C.R., passed away in 1916, he left me a sum of $25,000 to be paid out over 5 years. That is over $700,000 in today's money, making me financially comfortable. My family were early adopters of the automobile, and I had a Mercer Roadster delivered to Neenah in the summer of 1916. I would drive all over the state to enjoy many concerts. When I received my medical degree in 1917, the United States had just declared war on Germany. I enlisted in the Navy, but was initially rejected for having flat feet. But later that year, I passed my mental and physical exams and was made a lieutenant in the United States Navy. I spent 20 months at sea on the USS DeKalb and made 13 trips across the Atlantic on the troop carrier. My job as a surgeon was critical in the care of the wounded soldiers. During this time, I contracted hepatitis C. It's a viral infection that causes liver inflammation. The disease was likely transmitted via blood contact with one of the many soldiers I cared for. There's no cure for my hepatitis in a lifetime. My life expectancy was about 20 years. During my stint in the Navy, I was lucky enough to play with John Philip Sousa, the American composer and conductor known for his military marches. Sousa led the Navy band at the Great Lakes Naval Station near Chicago. Oh, how I love the march, Stars and Stripes Forever. I was honorably discharged from the Navy in 1919 and would end up living with Isabel and Orrin in their new home on the corner of 9th and Forest. I opened my medical practice at 106th West Wisconsin Avenue, right above Elwer's Pharmacy, and I set to work serving the residents of Neenah. In 1922, I married the girl next door, the beautiful and talented Doris Lockman. She grew up a block down the street from me. We connected in New York City, where she was attending Parsons School of Design while I was at Lenox Hill Hospital. We were said to be the most attractive young couple in Neenah at the time. A year later, Doris and I built a lovely English Tudor-style home on the river off of East Forest Avenue. Doris' garden, I had a sailboat. We were happy. And even happier when our children were born. Ronald Jr., he was born in 1925. And 5 years later, we welcomed little Doris Isabel. Our family was complete. The children would attend school with their cousins at the Winnebago Day School. There was a great focus on music, English, history, and geography. We joined the North Shore Country Club and loved the social scene there. Doris and I would go to New York City often to see the new plays, and of course, eat at the best restaurants. I was also the first post commander of the American Legion right here in Neenah. My medical practice kept me busy. I was often summoned to deliver first aid and emergency care. I was also president of the Winnebago County Medical Society, Theta Clark Hospital. I educated the community on health and safety. For example, in 1937, I gave a lecture to 11th and 12th grade boys at the brigade on health and morals. every year we would host dinner as well for the staff and graduates of the Theta Clark School of Nursing. The hepatitis I contracted in the Navy would continue to cause health issues. My daughter Doris described me as jovial and kind. She and the rest of my family were devastated when I passed away at Mercy Hospital in Oshkosh the night before Easter in 1942. I was only 51 years old. After my death, my family would leave Neenah. Doris never remarried and died in California in 1975. My mother, Isabel, was a force to be reckoned with. She brought me here to Neenah when I was young, and my entire life revolved around this city. I suppose it's only fitting that this is my final resting place with Isabel, Charles, Orrin, and of course, my beloved Doris. Thank you.
Are you ready for Sylvia Shepard? Yes. Ready for Sylvia. Woo. Okay. She is portrayed by Miranda Reidner, who is our museum coordinator at the Historical Society, and this event would not have been possible without Miranda's help. So, an extra round of applause for Sylvia.
You've heard from that woman there, have you? Well, now you can hear my side of the story, the Smith story. My grandfather was Elisha D. Smith, founder of Asha Woodenware. I was born in our family home on East Forest Avenue in September 1895, the third child of my father Charles and mother Jenny. My mother, just 28 years old, would not survive my birth, dying hours after I was delivered. Her death would change the trajectory of every story you hear this evening. When I was 3 days old, my mother's funeral took place in our family home. She was laid to rest in the Smith Mausoleum across from this chapel. My father was heartbroken. He was left to raise my two brothers, Carlton, Maury, and of course myself. It only took him a couple of years to find Belle. You do know Isabel was born Belle Bacon. Only later did she begin calling herself Isabel. Well, anyway, she came to Neenah, touting herself as a respectable widow who was teaching dance. But we know that she was a divorced mother of a young son. Isabel and my father were companions for a year or two before their controversial marriage in 1900. I was just 5 years old at the time. But I was happy enough to welcome a new brother and playmate. In my younger years, I traveled extensively with my father and Isabel, often accompanying them during trips to New York City. Once old enough, I began attending school in Boston. A young girl of my social standing required a more refined education than what you could find in Neenah. During my summers at home, I loved entertaining friends at parties. I was known to host dances at the Oshkosh Yacht Club featuring orchestras and dinners at the Riverside Country Club in Appleton. We also found ourselves in some trouble in 1914. Our sailboat capsized in a high wind on Lake Winnebago, and we had to be rescued by another boating party. We recovered quickly, though, and just a few weeks later took part in a mixed doubles tennis tournament in Oshkosh, several of which the preliminary matches were played at the Smith Court at our home. My brothers carried on our father's tradition of attending Princeton University while I was sent to Smith College in Northampton, Massachusetts. In May of 1916, I lost my dear father. I was a true orphan at 20 years old. Father's body was accompanied by family back to Neenah by train, just like the funeral of my mother when I was born. We said goodbye to Father in our home on East Forest Avenue. He is buried with my mother in the mausoleum. Father's massive estate would be divided between his children and Isabel. 2 months after his passing, I purchased a Stutz Roadster. Driving was a passion that I shared with Isabel. The Stutz was a fabulous, doorless, little sports car. Ugh, the freedom I felt while driving, it made me feel wonderful. By 1919, the Spanish flu pandemic was slowing, and the First World War had concluded. I was a wealthy, educated young woman, and I felt as if anything were possible. I would venture to California with my cousin Margaret to spend the winter, and that summer, back in Wisconsin, I was taken up in an airplane during a flight exhibition at Waverly Beach. I was given a 15-minute ride and even sat in the pilot's seat. It was exhilarating. I also upgraded my sports car to a Cadillac V8, which cost the equivalent of over $100,000 today. I also deeply involved myself with the Visiting Nurse Association and served as their vice president at only 24 years old. In December of 1920, the society pages announced my engagement to Donald Carrington Shepard. My brother Carlton issued invitations for August 27, 1921. The wedding would take place in our family home on East Forest Avenue. Isabel, by this time, had built her home a block away with her new husband, Orrin. The family home meant too much to me, and I made it clear I would raise my family there. Donald was from Buffalo, New York, and born to a father who was an iron merchant. Donald attended Yale, was even a part of its secret Skull and Bones Society. He served in the Great War as a lieutenant. Our wedding was a joyous day. We were married by the same reverend who married my father and Isabel. My brother Carlton walked me down the aisle. I wore a gown of white satin with lace and chiffon and a veil of tulle and lace. My bridesmaids wore dresses of orchid chiffon and lavender hats. Following the ceremony, there was a high tea reception and a performance from the Blackstone Orchestra from Chicago. We spent the early years of our marriage entertaining, traveling, and renovating the family home. In 1924, I gave birth to our first son, Donald Carrington Shepard, Jr. We called him Tad. 3 years later, our family was complete with the birth of Charles Robinson Smith Shepard. Having lost my own mother during childbirth, I chose to have my children in Chicago. I wanted to be near the best resources and most skilled physicians in case of an emergency. Education was also very important to me. We opened a private school with other families that operated out of our barn. Originally called the Progress School, its name changed to Winnebago Day School in 1931 when construction of the school began on Winnebago Avenue in Menasha. The school would operate for 40 years before being closed. My beloved Donald would become ingrained in the family business, started by my grandfather. Donald was associated with the Menasha Woodenware Corporation, and he retired as the vice president of Menasha Corp. Donald was an advocate for mental health and involved in our community. He passed at home in 1970 after he shared 50 years with me. Our children were remarkably successful. They each served in World War II, and both would attend their father's alma mater, Yale. Donald Jr., Tad, was devoted to the family business and community. He cared deeply about Menasha Corporation, its values, and its employees. He served on the Neenah School Board and pledged $500,000 to build the Neenah Public Library in 1999. He passed in 2011. Charles, we called him Chuck, served as the vice president of Yale's Center for Public Service and Social Justice. He was an educator at private and public schools, eventually becoming trained as a psychological counselor. He lived in Connecticut and New Mexico. He passed in 2010, a year before his brother. I left this earth in the home I was born in on a cold January day in 1975. I am buried here amongst my family, father, mother, Donald, my sons, even Isabel and her family. It's peaceful here in Oak Hill, my resting place beyond the only home I ever knew on East Forest Avenue.